Well, hi, good evening, and welcome to this edition of the American Lung Association Community Connections webinar series. My name is Tim Morris. I am a physician and the chair of the American Lung Association of San Diego's Mission Committee. This event right now, the webinar is sponsored by generous support from Sharp Healthcare, who are tremendous partners in the LA efforts to promote lung health in the community, and the Yohamatam Nation of San Manuel, who have been generous in their support and helping us promote this series to not only the San Diego community, but the San Bernardino community. This webinar was created in response to feedback from the American Lung Association Lung Health Action Advisory Committee, which is made up of people from the community who advise the Lung Association on the things that they think would be most helpful for them to hear about to impact their own lung health. The American Lung Association is producing tonight's webinar. This and previous presentations are available on YouTube via a link that I'm going to put on right now onto the chat. Hold on a second. And if you click on that chat and just remember that chat, then you'll see not only this recording, but you'll see other recordings of other types of lung health topic. So just to go over the format for tonight, the webinar will begin with a 30-minute presentation by Dr. Laura Crotty Alexander, who is an expert in the health effects of vaping. After that, there'll be a question and answer session that'll be primarily driven by Dr. Mike Welch, who is a panelist, and myself, and also questions from you, the participants, that have questions about what Dr. Crotty Alexander talks about. So please use the Q&A tab on the Zoom link to write your questions, and we'll read them right off live in the air. Without further ado, let me introduce our resident expert, Dr. Laura Crotty Alexander. Dr. Crotty Alexander went to college at Duke University, did a clinical research training fellowship at the NIH, and then back to Duke for medical school, did a residency at Massachusetts General Hospital, where she went on to become the chief resident. She did her fellowship in pulmonary critical care at the Massachusetts General Hospital, Brigham and Women's Hospital, and Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. She came out to San Diego to do a postdoc research fellowship in pulmonary and infectious disease. She was recruited onto our faculty and has rapidly risen through the ranks, and she is now the section chief of pulmonary critical care medicine at the Veterans Hospital in San Diego, and she is the associate division chief of the pulmonary critical care and sleep and physiology division at UCSD. She is a renowned and well-funded and well-published expert in the health effects of vaping, and she's here to talk with us about vaping and your lungs and lung health. Dr. Crotty Alexander, thank you.
Great. Thanks for that super kind intro, Tim. And I do want to encourage people, please ask questions. I love to talk about e-cigarettes. So feel free to interrupt if something comes your way. Otherwise, we will talk at the end of this 30-minute presentation. I always like to reflect on why I got into e-cigarette research in the first place. So I always like to start with a little bit on tobacco. And just as a reminder, tobacco smoking of this combustible product still causes a lot of harm worldwide, with 8 million deaths per year. And in the US, it's about 480,000 deaths per year. And of note, and I want you to keep this in mind as we start talking about e-cigarettes, is that 90% of combustible tobacco users initiate before the age of 18. So they become nicotine addicts at a very young age. But we're here to talk about vapes, e-cigarettes. So let's get into it. When e-cigarettes were first invented back in 2003, they were designed to look a lot like cigarettes. And so they were actually called cigalikes in that first generation product in the upper left-hand corner. But within a few years, they had evolved to really take on the shape of their own entity and could not be mistaken for combustible tobacco. This includes the vape pens in that second row, and then the mods or box mods in the third generation devices. Then the fourth generation came along in around 2017, and these are the types of vapes that are prevalent today. A lot of times they're called pod-based devices, pod mods, disposables. Uh, there's a lot of different terminology. So joules, juuling, elf bars, just lots of different words that I had to learn. But if you wanted to know more, you can use this QR code to go to the CDC's visual dictionary. And I think it's a really great tool for parents, for educators, healthcare professionals to understand a lay of the land of what are e-cigarettes, what are vapes, and what's in them. Um, and while there are a lot of different shapes and colors of these vapes, all of them have some similarities. So on the far left-hand corner, this is just a visual to show that each one has a cartridge or tank, and that's what holds the liquid chemicals that are then aerosolized via the atomizer. Each of these devices has a battery, which when activated, heats the liquid and then gets pulled through the atomizer to create the aerosol. So even though they look very, very different, they all have those core components. And I like to have a little bit of fun when I'm talking about e-cigarettes. So I often just search the web for the most interesting vapes that I can come across. And so this vape is shaped like a minion. So you would imagine that this is very appealing to kids. And it holds a lot of e-liquid so that you can take 4,000 puffs from this one device before it runs out. This is another one that I thought was very appealing. I felt like my kids would want to buy this. And I did want to make note that while I'm going to be talking primarily about e-cigarettes and vaping devices, and I'm sort of talking about nicotine-containing vapes, there are another set of things called vaporizers or vapes that are primarily for cannabis use. So these can look very different from the e-cigarettes that I've been talking about and will talk about. And they're primarily designed to work with marijuana herbs, crumble, and more thicker types of cannabis. So these cannabis vaporizers have some of the same components as the nicotine vapes, but they often have adjustable temperature as well. And these are the types of things that are put into the cannabis vapes. So solids predominantly, and that these are converted to an aerosol by heating them to very high temperatures. But returning to our nicotine vapes, what is in them? So for parents, again, healthcare providers, just anybody out there, it's important to know that these devices carry a lot of chemicals, but beyond that, they also have metals that end up in the liquid through the heating and aerolization process, and then you breathe that into the lungs, and it affects the cells across your body. More specifically, um, nicotine vapes always have a flavor. And we found out this the hard way when we were doing our first study, when we were recruiting young vapors to come into the lab so that we could take a look across their body and see, what the vaping was doing. And we asked them to switch to a vape with an e-liquid that was unflavored, and none of them could do it because it tasted terrible. So that's why these are flavored. So appealing flavors such as blueberry donut, strawberry cheesecake, chocolate, ice cream, gummy bear. And beyond that, the core contents of the e-liquid include PG, which is propylene glycol, and VG or glycerin. So these two things are great at dissolving chemicals, and that's why they were chosen when these devices were created. because they can put nicotine into these at pretty high concentrations so that when you inhale them, it gives you a high, a nicotine activating high. But beyond those things that were intentionally put in there and that we know are in there, we have researchers across the world have identified lots of other things in vapes, such as ultrafine particles, volatile organic compounds, cancer-causing chemicals, flavorants that I mentioned before, and some that we know cause disease, and then also heavy metals. And in fact, the area of heavy metals has been very hot recently. This article just came out a week ago, month ago, very recently. And that QR code takes you to an article about this that sort of summarizes the findings. But basically, what they found is that, a very short exposure where you're inhaling the e-cigarette aerosols leads to changes in metals in the lungs. So on the left-hand side, there's some pictures of mouse lungs, and in the top panel on the left is a normal lung with a lot of iron in it. So the red means very high amounts of iron, light blue is like medium amounts of iron, but a mouse on the right that had been inhaling nicotine vape aerosol, the iron is actually suppressed and not there, which is dangerous since iron is actually very important for health. On the bottom panel, you see the opposite, where nickel is not usually present in the lung of normal mice on the left, but on the right, mice that have been inhaling the e-cigarette aerosols have deposition of nickel in the upper aspect of the lung. You see that nice red area, as well as in the lower aspect. So we're learning a lot about metals in e-cigarettes, and now it's pretty clear that they are depositing across the body. I'd like to point out that vapes continue to evolve very rapidly. So this type of vape just came out about a year ago, where the user can adjust the amount of nicotine that they're inhaling and the amount of flavorant. So you see at the top of this one, it says ice level. And so you can decide for yourself, like how much of that cool menthol, like icy feel do you want from your vape? And then also how much nicotine do you want delivered per puff? This makes it very hard to research e-cigarettes because we can't test every combination because we just don't have that kind of money and also time. So we always have to pick, a certain combination of chemicals to test to try and figure out what their effects are on health. This one is also very interesting. So you buy a set of cartridges and then you can put them together in any combination because they're magnetic. So you might be in the mood for cherry on the far right, but maybe later in the day you want to add in guava and blueberry to get like, more of a pog flavor, a sort of real mix of fruit. One of the reasons that the flavorants have been studied quite a bit now is that these flavors are not like you take a blueberry and you mash it up and you add it to the e-liquid. They have chemists who design these flavors. So they'll grab anywhere from 5 to 30 different chemicals and put them together to create the mango flavor. And these chemicals typically have never been tested for inhalation safety. In this study, I just wanted to highlight it because we tested 4 different flavors: mint, mango, menthol, and tobacco. And with our friends Jorge in the top right and Juan Jun in the lower right, we found out that the tobacco and menthol flavors had a much larger effect on the gene expression of the lungs. Whereas the mint and mango, you'll see on the upper panels on the left, they had very mild effects on gene expression. So the takeaway here is that depending on the flavor, you can really affect like what is happening in the body. Now, I'm an immunologist, so I'm always interested in the effects on the immune system. We have known for many, many, many years that the inhalation of combustible tobacco smoke can dramatically alter the body's immune system and its ability to fight infections such as bacteria. viral pneumonias, and it can also alter the ability of the body to fight cancer cells. So we're learning a lot about e-cigarette effects, and I just wanted to highlight the effects on two different cell types. So the macrophage is an immune cell that's present across the body, and it is incredibly important in protecting us from bacteria, viruses, and just sort of maintaining health. And what we found in both human subjects who vape and in our mouse models, and by using cell cultures, is that the e-cigarette vaping exposure alters the ability of the macrophage to do its job. Similarly, the neutrophil, which is the most predominant type of white blood cell in your blood, it is altered by the inhalation of e-cigarette aerosol as well. And interestingly, it gets more activated in the presence of the vape, but its ability to go to the site of infection and kill bacteria is suppressed. So it's really concerning for potentially leading to increased numbers of infections and increased severe infections. So we recently sort of reviewed all the literature out there about the e-cigarette effects on all different types of immune cells across the body. And I love this infographic because it's a quick takeaway for all these different types of immune cells and what we think is going to happen over time. So, for example, on the far right in the middle, around 3 o'clock, are natural killer cells or NK cells. And in the presence of e-cigarette aerosols, they become sort of suppressed, and that's predictive of higher rates of cancer. Beyond that, we've been looking at inflammation both in the lungs on the left and across the body on the right. And on the right, you'll see that the current signals are that vaping increases inflammation across your body. And if you think of it in context of metabolic syndrome, obesity, similarly, we see elevated inflammation in those patients. We know that in cardiovascular disease, inflammation is a driver. So all of these signals sort of suggest that bad things are going to happen down the line. But let's circle back to who's using these and why are we worried about it? So, one good thing about America is that we have been fighting the tobacco epidemic pretty successfully for decades. And I really love this graph because it shows along the horizontal axis is years, starting in 2011 and going to 2024. And this is the data from our National Youth Tobacco Survey. And in the dark purple line, you'll see dark red line, the percent of high school students that use any form of tobacco. And you see that that has been decreasing over the last 13 years. In red are the cigarette smokers specifically, and that started at around 16% and now is down to around 2 to 3%. So again, we've done a great job at combating the combustible cigarette smoking epidemic in kids. But vapes are a whole new beast. And as of 2018, we had sort of peaked in terms of the number of middle and high schoolers who had tried these. And this is a graph showing that actually 18 to 29-year-olds, 85% of them in the lighter blue column had tried e-cigarettes. So this was, it matched with the times. I'm glad to say that this number is lower now, but this is still a habit of the young. So on the left-hand side, you see people are sort of grouped by age. So we have our 18 to 20-year-olds on the far left. And then on the far right are 65 and older adults. The dark blue bars are 2019 data, and the green bars are 2023. And you see that the highest rates of use of vapes are in the age range of 21 to 24. And you'll see that in this age range, it is increasing over time. Whereas in the far right-hand corner, that's the rate of adults who use it. And you see that vaping is hovering sort of around the 6 to 7% range. So, usually half as much as younger adults. And when we just look at tobacco product use in middle and high school students, you'll see in that second bar that the vast majority of what's being used are e-cigarettes, and that actually is followed closely by nicotine pouches. So we're at a current rate of about 6% of middle and high school students using e-cigarettes and about 2% using nicotine pouches. Interestingly, the nicotine pouches, several countries have really gone after these strongly with policy. So France banned these pouches in March of this year. Australia banned them this year. In California, we banned the flavors back in 2025. So it's been nice to see our policymakers really diving in and trying to stop the progression of this new epidemic. Um, these are a couple of my favorite e-cigarettes. So on the left is an e-cigarette designed as an inhaler, pretty sneaky, and on the right is an e-cigarette designed as a Sharpie. One thing I wanted to make sure everybody was aware of is that vaping in isolation is becoming like more and more rare. Most of the young adults that we interact with through our studies use at least two, if not three, different types of inhalants. So, tobacco, marijuana, vapes, combustible, edibles, all kinds of combinations we're seeing. And so, in our hands, we saw in this Venn diagram on the far right, 22% of our participants were users of cannabis edibles and smoked cannabis, as well as vaped. And in this study, we found that those who just use cannabis alone or just use nicotine alone had unchanged levels of sugar intake compared to controls on the far left. But our subjects who dual used cannabis and nicotine products, and that's the last column on the right, they had increased intake of sugary drinks and sweets, which is worrisome because these are young people. This was a study of teenagers, and we would worry that they will develop metabolic syndrome. This was confirmed by another group who published this article in 2024, and they went even a step farther to show that many users of cannabis, which is the larger pink circle on the right, and tobacco is the uppermost circle of blue, that many of them also use illicit drugs, which is the middle circle, as well as alcohol, which is the large green circle that sort of envelops them all. And what I found worrisome about this study in particular was that when these young people were asked about mental health diagnosis or treatment in the prior 12 months, those who solely used nicotine vapes had the highest rate of mental health diagnosis and treatments. That was followed closely by multi-use and compared to no e-cigarette and no multi-use. So we know that combustible tobacco use is associated with anxiety and depression, and now it's becoming more and more clear that vaping is also associated with those. I get a question a lot about why are people switching from vapes to smoking or from smoking to vaping? And Miss Innie Banjo joined our lab a couple years ago, and that was her key research question as well. And so she designed a study. We sent it to teenagers. And it was interesting that their answers for why they switched to smoking, that is the upper panel, were very similar to the teen answers to why did they switch to vaping. So you'll see that the ones who switched to smoking thought that smoking cigarettes was healthier, cigarettes were easier to get, and that they had friends or family who smoke. Whereas those who switched to vaping had friends or family who vape. Vaping nicotine is healthier than smoking, and nicotine vapes have better flavor. So I mention this because our messaging to the community needs to be improved about the differences between smoking and vaping. And I've had a big focus on preventing people from starting at all. I'm probably biased because I have two teenagers in my house, and I'm just really worried about them starting up an addiction while their brain is still developing. And we know that if you pick up one addiction, while your brain is still developing, you're much more likely to pick up another and another. But another reason why we don't want young people or anybody at all initiating nicotine or through these vape products is because we have a couple of really strong meta-analyses showing that it increases your odds of initiating combustible tobacco by fourfold. So this is very believable data because it's been seen multiple times now. So because we know this, we want to prevent people from starting at all because we're trying to stop people from ever smoking combustible tobacco, or at least, sorry, commercial tobacco. So that's like a lot of background about what's going on, who's using it, what's in them, but what harms are there really that we know about? So it does depend on, in green, the device generation, in blue, the flavors that you're inhaling, in purple, the nicotine concentration, in yellow, what you're combining it with, and then in red, how often are you using it, and in orange, like what type of wattage and temperature are you applying. If you want to game and vape at the same time, you can have that option. So you can take a puff and then keep gaming. This one is an old Nintendo uh, handheld controller that has been converted into a vape. And then this is, if you want to look like you're wearing an Apple Watch, you can. And it's actually the vape is the watch itself. So you get the clock function and the vape. And if you don't want to have to hold your vape in one hand and your phone in the other, this is a phone case that has the vape built in. Okay, but back to the nitty and gritty like health effects. The number one disease that we know is caused by vaping is EVALI, which is short for e-cigarette or vaping product use associated lung injury. And now you know why we shorten it to EVALI. So this was first identified in 2019. Many people became terribly sick. It was found to be a disease of young men, and it's probably because they were the primary vapors of THC. Since then, we've still seen this disease entity, but it's seen in both vapors of nicotine and in vapors of THC. But the original epidemic was due to vitamin E acetate being added to that e-liquid that we've talked about. And it was added because it had the same consistency as THC/CBD. And so they were adding it to be able to cut the amount of cannabis in there and make more money. So now we know it's dangerous to inhale vitamin E acetate. Totally safe to put it on your skin, totally safe to eat it, but don't inhale it. If you want your e-cigarette as part of your hoodie, they do sell those too. Um, we have been excited to be looking at our rhesus macaque data. This is the best way to study what the effects of vaping are in the airways and the lungs of teenagers because it is very difficult to get the money and the approval ethically to um, take lung biopsies from human teenagers for obvious reasons. But when we ran the study with the help of Lisa Miller up at UC Davis, we did find that on the left, the tracheas were very damaged and inflamed by inhaling the e-cigarette aerosols. And on the right, the lungs themselves had a lot of inflammation and pneumonia in them. If you want your vape as part of your backpack. It makes it very portable. They put it into the side, so you just sort of like it's like you're taking a puff, or sorry, taking a drink of water, but it's actually your vape. And most recently, we just repeated this study, so waiting for the data as we speak. But Kat in the lower right-hand corner and Arthur Brody, our collaborator, basically imaged mouse brains and found that there is an alteration in a really important protein in the brain that indicates that these vapes are really altering the brain across the tissues. This vape sort of could function as a smartphone. It syncs with your phone like an Apple Watch. And this one, if you like looking at lots of photos, like you have photo albums, you can upload your photo albums to it. I'm nearing the end, so glad that I made it to my cancer slides because this is also a question that I get asked a lot. Does vaping cause cancer? And we can say now that it does. It is driving these signals for a couple of different reasons. So this work we did with Shumita and Ibrahim, and we found that these are colons from mice that had inhaled the e-cigarette aerosols for a couple of months. And we found that the e-cigarette inhalation led to the same amount of inflammation in the colon as cigarette smoking in blue compared to dual use, an hour of each in purple, having the highest amount. And inflammation is a driver of cancer. When we checked in our mouse models, we found also that the e-cigarette aerosol increased the number of lung tumors per mouse. And most recently, a large study of human subjects found that if you vape and smoke, you have a 21-fold higher rate of developing lung cancer compared to a 6-fold increase if you're simply a combustible tobacco smoker. So this was really eye-opening for a lot of people, and I just want to emphasize it because it's a main takeaway that I want you to have is that when you combine vaping and smoking, that's when we're seeing the worst effects on health across the body. Now, we're lung doctors, so we also worry about asthma, emphysema, COPD. A little bit is known in this area, so I just wanted to summarize some of the biggest studies that have been done to date. Um, so in the top one, Perez et al., they found a much increased risk of asthma onset in young people. In the middle one, the Delmas, they found that vaping was associated with increased rates of cough, wheeze, and in the bottom one, Dirasanala found a higher prevalence of asthma in dual vapor smokers as well as e-cigarette vapors. For COPD, multiple mouse models have been run, and we have seen emphysema in some of those, but it's going to depend on your genetics. Just like some people can smoke combustible tobacco for decades and never get emphysema, whereas other people develop emphysema quite quickly over, a few number of years. Okay, so if you were to take away three things from this talk, one, because I'm an immunologist, vaping alters the immune system, which will lead to lung and systemic diseases. Two, e-cigarettes will cause cancer. And three, e-cigarettes affect every cell across the body, just like combustible tobacco, because you inhale it and it enters your bloodstream and hits everything across the body. There is still some opportunities in policy, and the American Lung Association is doing a lot of great work in this area. One thing that might help is limiting the amount of nicotine in these vapes. Multiple countries across the world have either limited nicotine concentration to like 20 milligrams per ml or even zero. And then really banning flavors that target children, women, and people of color, such as sweet flavors and menthol flavors. And finally, raising taxes on vapes is a good opportunity. And this is a musical vape. Their tagline for the advertisement is music for your lungs, which is just painful for me to say. And of course, a thank you to all my collaborators and the lab crew because they're always helpful in everything I do and inspirational. So thank you very much.
Well, that was just great, Dr. Crotty Alexandra. Thank you very much for that. That was really an expert level talk that was brought down to a level that even I could understand. So I appreciate that. Um, so we do have a few questions that have been generated by the audience and by the panelists, but let me ask you right up front, could you explain a little bit about what exactly is it about vaping that makes it so addictive? Is it just that nicotine is a very addictive drug and that's it, or is there anything else about it that leads to that?
Yeah, great question. It's primarily the nicotine, um, because the nicotine activates the dopamine reward pathway. And just like any addictive substance, there are some people who will become addicted the first time they use it, and other people who can sort of dabble in it on and off for years, before they become like truly addicted. So vaping is very similar to combustible tobacco in that way, as that it's really the nicotine that it activates that reward pathway, and it makes you feel so good that you crave it over and over again. And I've heard moms, who have watched their kids become vaping addicts just lose interest in other activities like
Hmm.
playing with their dog or going to play sports, because those activities cannot activate the dopamine reward pathway to the extent that these very high doses of nicotine can. Um, and then the
Hmm.
ones who've been successful and have gotten them off of the vapes, like to watch them go through the withdrawal and the struggles has been really intense as well.
Wow, interesting. Dr. Welsh, did you have questions?
Yeah, well, play off that question, Tim. The dose of nicotine that you're getting when you're vaping versus smoking cigarettes and getting the nicotine, what's the kind of correlation between a vaping session and cigarette smoking? What kind of scale of exposure are you getting relative to the each method?
Yeah, great question, Mike. And a lot of people had that question early on, in particular, when we were trying to figure out what we were dealing with. And it turns out that people who are already cigarette smokers are very good at self-dosing. So they can take a vape that has like 5 milligrams per mil and a vape that has 50 milligrams per mil, and they can use each one to exactly the right amount to give them the level of high that they're used to from smoking combustible tobacco.
Yeah.
So we really were worried that with the super high nicotine concentrations of the latest generation, that people would be dramatically increasing their nicotine addiction. Um, but when people truly switch from one to the other, they tend to keep their nicotine intake kind of similar, maybe a little bit higher with the vapes, just to try and really make sure that they're getting the high to not crave the combustibles. But it's been pretty interesting to see people learn that over time.
Hmm.
I hope that
Okay.
answers your question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Laura, there
But
was a question in the chat, and this is actually from Dr. Fuster. Maybe we might be able to get it, bring him on directly, but let me read off his question to you. And he was interested about the rates, whether rates are increasing of people that are both smoking and using vape. And he was remarking about how they may have some kind of synergistic effect because lung cancer rates seem like they're higher in dual users than even in single users.
That is quite right. And that is the biggest cancer signal that we've seen from across the body, is that combining the combustible tobacco inhalation with the vaped aerosol, there's something, some sort of interaction happening that's really dramatically increasing the cancer risk. Um, One thing is that they have very different components. So outside of nicotine, they're very different. The combustible tobacco has, 4 to 7,000 chemicals, and very few of those are identical to the 100 to 150 in a given vape. Even though if you study all the vapes, that adds up to thousands of chemicals as well. But if you have one vape in your hand, that's typically 100 to 150 chemicals. Um, we've identified DNA damage caused by the vapes, inflammation, and then alterations in the immune system. And when you sort of combine those, that is pro-tumorigenic, pro-carcinogenic. And so, we understand that it will cause cancer, but somehow combining those pro-cancer effects with the known effects of the combustible tobacco is where we really get into trouble. In terms of rates of dual use across the world, not that much is known. Um, Lots of places aren't like tracking vaping quite as much as we are. And some countries have banned vaping, but then it actually makes it a little bit harder to tell like who is actually vaping there because like they don't have the data because you're not allowed to use them. So it's been like a little bit tricky to see who's vaping versus who's smoking. But we do know that in the US, it is the biggest group who are dual users of both are our older adults, usually those who were already smokers and have added in the e-cigarette vapes.
Okay. Um, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about you had mentioned immune cells and cancer, and I've heard the expression immune surveillance, and could you just explain what that's all about? Like, why if you knock out some immune cells, does that make you more likely to get cancer?
Yeah, great question. So we all, and I'm not going to put this elegantly, but I've heard it so elegantly before. I always wish I could do it justice. Um, all of us have sort of tumor cells in our body, that are arising even on like a daily basis. And luckily, our immune system has evolved to be able to identify those cancer cells and then kill them before they cause trouble. So when you take out that sort of gatekeeper sort of function, these cells like are constantly surveying your body, like looking for these trouble cells. And when they aren't doing that, that means that the tumor cells that are arising naturally then don't have anybody to take them out. And so then they can propagate and get bigger and bigger. So that's what we think is happening. So there's like a triple threat. So we have the DNA damage, which is well known to cause cancer. Um, we have the immune system being altered so that it's not as good as at locating these cells and taking them out. But then we also have decreased DNA repair. So just like the body's evolved to have these immune cells to take out the cancer cells, our cells are also really good at trying to repair themselves. So when you get a little bit of DNA damage, then that sets up a whole string of events and things go in there and fix the DNA, and then the cell can carry on. But the e-cigarette aerosols we have found suppress the DNA repair pathways. And so that again sort of pushes more towards the cancer pathways.
Okay.
We have a lot more to learn about it clearly, but it's nice that we have something to work with now.
Yeah. I have a kind of a very different question, but you had shown us all these different things that are in the liquid that's being vaped. And I'm thinking, if I go to the store and I buy an ice cream or something like that, and I take it home and I eat it and it makes me sick, well, I know that there's somebody responsible there that, there shouldn't be anything in ice cream that, gives me an infection or something like that. And I kind of rely on that when I go to the store. I don't have to independently test these foods. I just buy them, and I figure somebody's keeping poisons from getting inside me. Is there the same sort of thing with this liquid in vapes? Is there somebody watching over to make sure that nothing bad goes in there?
I wish.
Huh.
Yeah, it's just so terrifying to me that you can walk into a store and like buy all this stuff and yeah. So, yeah, it's very scary. Technically, the FDA regulates these products. So there is a safety reporting portal. So if you were to like Google how to report a health effect of a vape, it should take you there, and then you can tell the FDA what happened to you. Um, so hopefully somebody's keeping track of those and hope not they're not just going into the ethos. I also recently met a woman who is an expert in studying the e-liquids and what's in them. And people will directly mail her their vapes when they've had like a bad side effect. And they'll ask her to run it through her mass spec to see like, is there a specific toxin in there? Um, and so she's actually run a ton of e-liquids through her mass spec and found all kinds of stuff.
Hmm.
Um, and then she'll like publish it, she'll share that data, freely. But of course, that's not like an official pathway. But
Yeah,
she's
I mean,
really loud and she advocates, and so she does enact change that way.
that sounds like a different procedure than what I count on for, my food. I mean, it seems like, in my food, I kind of figured that someone's telling me, what you buy it, it's probably safe to eat. I mean, you're telling me is that vaping is that, there might be some stuff in there. And, for whoever made it, there's nobody telling them not to do this. But if it does end up hurting you, at least you can tell somebody about it and maybe there's an effect down the road. But it hardly sounds like a guarantee that the substance doesn't have a lot of harmful stuff in there.
Yes, I completely agree with all of that. It's been interesting as the FDA has gotten into finally regulating them over the last few years to see which vape products they've decided to approve. And it's been very difficult to see what they're basing that on. So usually it's a tobacco company that has submitted their data supporting the safety of the product. And knowing what the tobacco companies have done in the past makes it just seem very unlikely that that's trustworthy data.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's been interesting to watch things evolve, and gotta I wish things were better, but
And I'm kind of curious about the immediate effects of vaping. And you mentioned, and I didn't realize that vaping has um, uh, runs a risk of causing asthma in you. And imagine that's just while you're vaping, and in the week that you vaped, that has a possibility of causing that. And I also noticed that you were talking about it's when you said suppressing immune cells, and of course I think, well, that means that you must get infections, or you may be more prone to them. Is there some evidence that people get more infections if they vape?
I was asked that by, I swear, like every person I knew during COVID, because they were like, well, you're the expert. Like, don't you know? Like, are you more likely to get COVID if you vape? Are you more likely to get severe COVID if you
Mm-hmm.
vape? Um, and all the studies were very mixed. And so there really wasn't a clear signal coming out. And that comes back to one of the difficulties with these products is combustible tobacco, the 4 to 7,000 chemicals, and they're pretty similar across different brands. I mean, because at the heart, they take a dried tobacco leaf and they put it in, a cigarette and you smoke it. Whereas the e-cigarettes, like the liquid composition of these are incredibly different, device to device, including those flavorants. And the flavorants themselves can have these powerful effects. And sometimes they have the opposite effects of like the nicotine and the vehicle chemicals. So they sort of cancel each other out. Whereas sometimes the flavorants are in the same direction as the nicotine and flavorants. So we're trying to study this at the population level. So people are using all these different flavors, all these different types, and so ones that might increase susceptibility to infection are put in the same group as people who might have ones that actually like, decrease susceptibility to infection. So I think it's been incredibly hard to see a signal. That's where our mouse studies and our in vitro studies have been most helpful because we can have a mouse vape and then infect the mouse and see what happens.
Right.
And you get a bit more consistency and you're studying a very specific vape. Um,
Dr. Fuster had a question about is it the liquid or the vehicle or the emissions that are the most carcinogenic, and if so, have people identified which components of that vaping liquid are seem to be the most likely to cause cancer?
Yeah, and I would say that when we did some of our studies, we didn't use flavorants. And so we really were looking at the vehicles, so the propylene glycol, glycerin, so the PGVG, and the nicotine. So we were really trying to focus on those core components that you find in every single vape because we wanted our data to be like broadly applicable. Um, and those core chemicals are the ones that are causing DNA damage, are decreasing DNA repair, altering the immune system. So we do know that, but then you throw in these different other chemicals on top of them for different products, and that can change what's happening in the dish, in the mouse, in the human. Hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Walter, do you have another question?
Yeah, I did. Laura, address the perception, the hope, the belief that these products were going to get you off regular combustible cigarettes. Can you address that whole, how did that turn out to be was it the case or not? And do you see any role for that? And despite all these not very good attributes of e-cigarettes.
Absolutely. I'm glad you asked that question. Um, so, do e-cigarettes help people quit tobacco? The answer is no, but it gets a little bit into the minutia. Um, can somebody switch from combustible tobacco to fully becoming a vapor and thus like quit the combustible tobacco? And the fourth generation, the modern generation of devices, they are useful for that. They can help with that. So if you have a family friend, a patient, and they say, they've been smoking tobacco for decades, they've never been able to quit, they've tried everything, nothing's worked, and they're thinking about trying these e-cigarettes or vaping products, um, you can tell them that yes, some people have found that useful for getting off of the combustible tobacco. However, it doesn't treat the nicotine addiction. So they remain addicted to nicotine, and these are tobacco products, so they remain addicted to tobacco. And the number one thing that you do have to tell them is if they're going to switch, they must switch completely, 100%. They can either be a smoker or a
Yeah,
vapor. They cannot
yeah.
use them
They'll be
together.
dual.
Yes.
Hmm.
And then
They'll
if
be a
they were
double
to
hitter.
switch, can they be harm reducing? A lot of people don't believe that they are. Um, they're, we've done a ton of studies on them. In most cases, they look less dangerous than combustibles. So maybe they are less dangerous, but in the end, you'd still be addicted to nicotine and you would still need to get counseling or medications or nicotine replacement to help you get off of the vapes.
Gotcha. Okay.
Laura, do you know, back in the day before vaping existed, there was a lot of work done on how to get people to stop smoking. And it turns out that from a public health standpoint, all of these posters of lung cancer and these, they remember the old ads of these people have these terrible, tumors and that didn't seem to work all that much. And what really helped was things like, making it a pain in the neck and increasing the cost of cigarettes and regulations. You can't smoke inside a building, and if that seemed to reduce the rates. Do you know anything about what the best strategy is to try to prevent vaping in that way?
In general, it's been the same strategies that work for combustible tobacco also work for vapes. So that's the good news is that, if we're trying to prevent, if we're trying to help people quit, like using all the same things that we have in place for combustible tobacco seem to be working well for our vapors as well. And similarly, the best way to, stop the tobacco smoking is to prevent initiation, stop them from ever becoming a smoker. Same thing is true in vaping. It's like if you could stop them from starting, then you're winning a lot more.
Got it. Well, listen, I really wish we could talk about this for hours and hours because it's really been fascinating. But I think we have just enough time for me to thank Dr. Laura Crotty Alexander for a fascinating talk and for a brilliant discussion. Thank the panelists, Dr. Welsh, and although we couldn't quite get your picture on here, Dr. Mark Fuster. I want to thank our producers, Rita Zing and Lynn Zhang, who made all of this happen. I want to thank Rita Rodelli and Michelle Gonzalez from the American Lung Association for all of the support in making this all a reality. Stay tuned for next time when we're going to have the similar type of session that will focus on lung cancer screening with Dr. Mark Fuster and Dr. Philippe Mongrain. So until then, stay healthy. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.